Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. It's History with Sire here today to discuss with you further about the origins of civil rights, and we're going to go from the slavery era to the Civil War between 1789 and 1865. If you haven't already, do make sure you've checked out the previous video where I went into a bit of background about the American political system, the idea of the American dream, and what we exactly mean by civil rights. We will do more on this as the series goes on. Well, make sure you are keeping up with the lessons as we go through it. Do remember as well, this is a lesson catered towards the student level, so our content will provide with some key contextual knowledge and practice our historical skills along the way. With all of that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So, as said, we'll now start, of course, with the actual initial context and give us a background right up to, of course, the Civil War and a bit beyond that as we go forward. I do want to really stress at the start here that this is an introductory video, and this era of the history in the 1800s, we are really going to sadly have to gloss over. There's a lot more history that happens here, and there are indeed studies that focus on this. Because we're focusing on the student level, a lot of our civil rights history will be about the 20th century's progression. So I do deeply apologize to those of you who may want more of this earlier era stuff. If you do wish for more of it, if you have a curriculum out there that is crying out for this, that you want some support with, do let me know in the comments, and I'll be happy to extend this series and include some civil rights information and contextual knowledge around that. So the first part we need to understand is this initial slavery era that America was found within. Now, when America was first founded, it was founded through a revolutionary war between the 13 colonies in America and the British Empire. It fell out with the British Empire over a variety of issues. Most of it was around the monarchy and its attempts to put taxation on the American people. It broke away after a big incident at Boston, particularly when they threw loads of tea imports into the nearby river. And so a big war occurred, and eventually this gentleman here on the far left, George Washington, he was part of the victorious Union Army, and they broke away and finally became free from British control. The nation then formed its own constitutional, and within it the founding fathers, with George Washington leading amongst them, spoke of how America should be a liberal, free-speaking nation where anyone could seek refuge, be free, and achieve the idea of the American dream. In effect, it wanted to be a utopia after struggling as a colony state under Britain and wanted to be a place where everyone could be free and strive and be free from that tyranny and oppression. However, this dream was not something that was a reality for all Americans. The African American community in particular was struggling in this society. They faced torment, poverty, and above all, and quite sadly, slavery. Now, when America was being formed, slavery became a big part of its own economy. When we say slavery in this aspect, we mean where there is a legal ownership of another person, a living, breathing person, being owned as property by another. In America, this will last a really, really long time. America is not going to be abolished for nearly the first 80 years of its own existence. These slave people, as they were defined, as mere property rather than people under the Constitution, they had no political rights at all. They could not vote, they could not own property, and they were not even classified legally as American citizens. Initially, the Constitution of the United States, which had all these rules the country was going to follow, did mention that slavery was actually going to be legal, which is quite contradictory to what you thought it was trying to be built upon. The reason for this was because it was quite profitable to the southern colony states. They were really profiting from using these slaves as farmers on their cotton fields. These farmers were, of course, using them to pick the cotton for them, and they would refine it and then sell it for their own money. And again, because they were slaves, plantation owners did not have to pay them any money. They merely housed them, fed them the minimal amount, and would sadly beat them and force them into work. Because the Constitution defined African Americans as lesser people and therefore the property of these plantation owners, they could force them to work wherever they desired. Soon, the southern states housed over 4 million slaves that were owned to these wealthy cotton farmers by 1860, and it was quite commonplace for these slaves to, of course, have children, and then they would be inherited to the next generation and the next. And it would really form a spiral where there was now an institutionalized system where whites, especially in the South, had a simply better life than the blacks, and they built into it over the decades. These plantation owners were incredibly wealthy because, as I say, they didn't know how to pay these workers, and they held this considerable political power, especially the power to vote, over them. They defended the institution of slavery as their own legal right, and this is where the federal government had a really big problem. It had wanted to spread this idea of life, liberty, and happiness onto these various states, but because of it allowing what's called states' rights, where the states have quite a lot of freedom to make laws themselves, they could resist and push back against these federal laws. And said it was quite degrading for these slave people. Their treatment was really brutal, quite degrading, and basically inhumane. There were whippings, there were executions, they were living in squalid conditions. They barely had any clean water, they barely ate, they were being worked in the hot beating sun all hours of the day. It was gruesome. It was just bizarre that this system could be allowed to develop into what it was. Many of the Southern states also denied the slaves the opportunity to learn to read or write because there was this belief amongst many of the Southerners that if they allowed the slaves to become educated, these African Americans would realize that they were not designed for this. They were not supposed to be oppressed and controlled like this by the white Southerners, and so then would probably try and rebel and try and escape and put an end to slavery. There's a clear power relationship within this institution. However, in the northern states, it was a lot more progressive. There were virtually next to no slaves, especially by the mid 1800s. They actually had even in places for you to become free slaves where you could actually gain your freedom over time. This tended to come by whites marrying or having children with some slaves, and therefore because they of course meant they had now a mixed race child, this child was no longer seen as impure the way the white owners viewed the African Americans. However, they were still not completely equal. These supposed free states really became less racist over time because they were more industrial, they were more urbanized, they relied, as time went on more factory work. They were not as economically dependent on the plantations and therefore the slave industry as the southern states had become. And so, these differences between the North and the South really began to boil over as the years went on. There was a growing expansion occurring in America throughout these decades. Again, it started just as 13 colonies, but as times goes on, as railway networks are created, as nations are sold, for instance, France sold a whole swath of the southern and western states to America under Thomas Jefferson during its Napoleonic era. And so America was expanding and growing and really progressing as a nation after the Louisiana Purchase. When we get to 1861, a real bind starts to occur because as America has expanded, every few years it's gained a slave state, one more southern aligned who support the plantation industry, and one more aligned with the North who wants to stay industrialized and crucially put an end to the slave states that are occurring down south. And as I say, this comes to a real big head in 1861 with the new Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, the gentleman here on the right. When he takes power, he really preaches this idea that the northern states should take control and free the African Americans from their binds in slavery and put an end towards it. This was a real big problem for the southern states, and this was the final straw. As we said, we've had states' rights conflicting against federal rights, and now the southern states are going to break away from the Union to form their own America. As you can see on the diagram, these states became what's known as the Confederacy, a very pro-racist, very Herrenvolk nation. They were lying that they weren't racist. They were just defending their economy, defending their prowess that the plantations gave them. But you can't deny the fact that these plantations and the very economy that they had, the very wealth they owned, was built on this slave system, risking the entire Union and the survival of America on this issue. Lincoln dared to declare war on the Southern Confederacy. Within the war, Abraham Lincoln declared the Emancipation Proclamation, calling for the end to slavery and the abolishment of it, and for America to once again be united with the Union now as the leading faction rather than the Confederacy and the plantation. This American Civil War really caused a splinter, and it really became a big question in America's history if it would survive it. But it did. The war eventually did end in a Union victory. The North won after 4 desperate, hard years of fighting. Over 750,000 lives died in the conflict for the North's victory, and he really wanted to put this proclamation through, and he wanted to reconstruct America in a better image. But he sadly would not get the chance to do so. He was assassinated by many people who were against him, many people who wanted the slave states to continue. And so when he was assassinated, this left the Democrat President Andrew Johnson to take over. And as we're going to see, he has some different ideas of how America should be run in the post Civil War era. What are those ideas? What exactly will we encounter? Well, that's what we're going to find out in the next part of this lesson as we go into the post Civil War era and encounter Reconstruction and the Jim Crow laws. Thank you as always for watching this video. I hope you found it insightful. Again, if you do want me to go into more detail about things like the Civil War or the pre-Civil War era, particularly the rise of the free states and slave states dynamic, again, if you do let me know, and I'll try and find a way to create that content for you if indeed it is relevant for you, especially those of you at the student level. With all that said, this has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.